Fantastic. And thank you to the University of Technology, Sydney, for inviting me to talk about research, which is just taking shape at the moment. I certainly welcome feedback. Before kicking off, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I reside, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. So, for the last year, I've been researching the truly fraught relationship between digital hostility in its various forms and freedom of speech. Free speech has historically, at least in the West, been regarded as worthy of defending, even when that speech is truly vile. After all, a society which encourages a range of voices to be heard in the public sphere is surely a society that's committed to democracy. In this presentation, I want to test this idea of freedom of speech's inherent benefit by asking, is trolling freedom of speech? Trolling is speech, so surely it should be defended. Or do we require new frames through which to understand the benefits and dangers of open communication in the digital media scape? I hope you don't mind me pausing. I've got someone ringing at my door. I do apologise. I'll be back. Freedom of speech has historically been understood as a linchpin of democracy. Censorship has been understood as democracy's antithesis. So, in 1859, the classic liberal theorist, small l, liberal there, John Stuart Mill, wrote, "The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, those who dissent from the opinion, still more those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity for exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of the truth produced by its collision with error." We've been hearing a lot about freedom of speech, at least here in Australia, over the last decade or so. In particular, its apparent endangerment via ideologically motivated forces. Witness, for example, the heated Australian media debate last year about whether or not rugby player Israel Folau was unfairly treated via sacking for an April 2019 Instagram post which demanded that homosexuals and other groups repent for their supposed sins. As some of you who will be familiar with the case will know, what Folau was saying at the time was, this is in fact a sincere expression of his Christian faith, and that he was being punished for expressing it, that he actually had no animosity towards homosexuals. So, as Mill stated, the only speech that is beyond defence is speech which causes harm to others. And this is what Mill has referred to as the harm principle. Let's now turn to trolling, which we've already heard quite a bit about today. This term refers to the posting of material online with the aim of generating heightened and usually adverse responses from its targets. Not all trolling, I think it should be pointed out, is inherently harmful. Witness the so-called Rickroll, where the unsuspecting internet user clicks on a link and is transported to the 1980s videos of Rick Never Gonna Give You Up Astley. Don't worry, I'm not going to start singing. The better known forms of trolling, and certainly the forms that we've been talking about today, are those that aim to offend, insult, and harm. They usually, though not always, are based on factors such as socioeconomic status, gender, sexuality, race, religion, and so forth. So, in one sense, trolling is a perfect example of speech in the era of the so-called Web 2.0. Web 2.0 internet users are encouraged, we are encouraged to be interactive, to interact with the media texts that we're consuming, to get involved. The two sites that I'm focusing on in my research are below the line comment sections of online publications. So yes, I've been reading the comments. And social networking sites, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit. These sites seem to encourage the open and inclusive deliberation of ideas that freedom of speech supporters have long championed. These spaces seem to encourage a range of viewpoints, not all of which will necessarily align with each other. So I come back to my question. Should trolling be defended or at least not censored? After all, what is trolling if not speech? Should trolling be silenced on the grounds that it can harm? Where do we draw the line? What do we do? Now, it might seem that the questions I've been posing this morning are merely academic. I'd suggest that's not so. My research investigates how content moderators, those responsible for moderating content on online platforms and media spaces, grapple with these questions in their work, in their professional habitats. And I focus on content moderators because they are what US scholar Carlton Gillespie calls custodians of the internet, the ones who decide what content remains online and what doesn't, whose voices get heard in the digital public sphere and whose don't. As Gillespie puts it, platforms must in some form or another moderate, both to protect one user from another or one group of its antagonists, and to remove the offensive, vile, or illegal, as well as to present their best face to new users, to their advertisers and partners, and to the public at large. Put simply, without content moderators, online platforms would cease to exist. We need them. Every day, content moderators must make crucial decisions about what to delete and what to leave in the online spaces they manage. These decisions are often made quickly and can be controversial. Reflecting on her time as a content moderator, Jennifer Beckett, now an academic at the University of Melbourne, writes, "I've been abused for not getting comments down fast enough or deleting or hiding them, being called a left-wing ideologue, a right-wing apparatchik, a fucking moron, and told to insert choice, sexual act of choice here." This kind of feedback can be distressing, and it can create a hostile, unsafe working environment for the moderator, not to mention those who readers who encounter this content. So some of the material that content moderators delete is obviously toxic and should be removed. These include death and rape threats, insults relating to race, gender, sexuality, misinformation relating to public health, e.g. anti-vax and COVID denialist propaganda, QAnon propaganda. This is a major part of my current research project. This kind of material is frequently aggressive in content It's very likely to cause psychological and or physical harm, both to readers and to the moderators themselves. Other material might be more difficult to decide on. Take this hypothetical scenario. A devoutly Christian man or woman announces his opposition to same-sex marriage in the comment section of a pro-same-sex marriage article. The reader says he wishes no malice towards homosexuals. He believes that same-sex marriage is against God's law and that legalizing it will have dire ramifications for civilization as we know it. This man is expressing an opinion that many readers, and indeed the journalist, may find abhorrent. Perhaps the commenter wanted to distress the author and other readers. Look, perhaps they were trolling. So the question arises, should this comment be deleted by the moderator or retained as the kind of free speech, the open deliberation of ideas that below the line comment sections appear to encourage? The author might well be trolling, but they surely have a right to express their own point of view. This viewpoint is based on a skewed interpretation of Christian faith, as well as attitudes towards homosexuality and marriage that are outdated and offensive. But does offence itself equal harm? And if no harm has been done, then surely the speech should be retained, saddening and enraging, as well as ridiculous, though some readers might find it. Now, if this scenario does sound familiar, perhaps it should. These kinds of questions were raised in much of the journalistic coverage of Israel Folau's 2019 Instagram post. I've been working on a study about the ethics of the Folau case and the questions about freedom of speech it raises with Dr. Dennis Muller from the University of Melbourne. And it's been eye-opening. So, back to our scenario. Let's say harm has been done. The challenge becomes proving it. Who has been harmed? The moderator? A reader? Both? How is the harm to be measured? And is it the moderator? Whose role is it to measure this? Is it the moderator? Is it the person who claims to have been harmed, whether they're an employee or a consumer? Measuring harm can be deeply subjective, not to mention distressing. Considerations relating to free speech and trolling are, of course, not the only considerations that a content moderator is faced with when faced with trolling on the spaces they moderate. The moderator must also consider their employer's community guidelines, if indeed the employer has community guidelines. Some organisations do, some don't. It's a case of anything goes. And whether the trolling content contravenes those guidelines. It might be offensive, it might be controversial, but should it then be deleted? The moderator must also consider the economic fallout if commentators respond indignantly to their comments being deleted and the commentator chooses to abandon that platform. Of course, economic fallout is also a danger facing the content moderator. Research within and outside Australia has been revealing that many content moderators, many people doing this work, are often doing so on a precarious basis. They're low paid, they're very ill-equipped or prepared by their organisations to handle some of the online toxicity they are faced with in their working lives. They're often working on short-term contracts. So they have employment considerations of their own. They've got their own survival Their own survival is at stake. Moving forward. So just some final thoughts before I wrap up for today. To answer the question posed earlier in the paper, yes, trolling can indeed be understood as an example of freedom of speech. What else is it? In stating this, my aim is not to suggest that freedom of speech is simply another way of saying freedom to offend, though that certainly may be the case for some internet commentators, be they journalists or your everyday pundit. My point is that conceptualizing freedom of speech as always and only worth defending is naive. This was naive in the days of John Stuart Mill, and it's especially naive in an era in which the opportunities to have one's voice heard in public spheres has amplified due to the affordances of digital technology. The case study of the content moderator and some of the difficult decisions they face in their professional habitats in regard to whether to retain or delete material, or perhaps more accurately speech, bears this point out, I think. Clearly, we, as online communicators all, require new frames through which to conceptualise the truly fraught relationship between free speech and trolling, as well as those concepts as standalone concepts. We cannot simply rely on claims of harm and harmfulness to determine the kinds of speech that should be encouraged or even regarded as acceptable in online spaces. Harm is hugely important, as the previous two speakers have very clearly and powerfully demonstrated, but it's not the only factor. My research aims to uncover what some of those new frames might be. So stay tuned. Thank you.